It's 10 o'clock, past 10 o'clock even, so let's get started. Last week I talked about one of the methods, one of the group of methods to put a price on something that is not traded on the market. And today I'm going to talk about the other group of methods around stated preferences. And I'm going to talk at length about contingent valuation and a bit shorter about choice modeling because a lot of the things carry over between the two. This is where we are. We're in week 6. This is the last week of the block on monetary valuation of environmental goods and services. Let's start with the principles of stated preferences. Essentially what you do in stated preference methods is that you infer the preferences, that's what it's about for environmental goods or services, from what people say about their intended behavior on hypothetical markets for such goods and services. There's two flavors of this. One, the older one, is the contingent valuation method, which actually comes in a great many variants. And essentially there you ask people the direct question, how much would you pay for this good or service? And then there is contingent choice, also known as choice modeling, also known as choice experiments, where you essentially give people options to choose from. And essentially there you ask the question, would you pay X for good A, Y for good B, or would you rather go home empty-handed and not buy anything? So those are the two basic methods that are there. The key advantage, as I said last week, is the opposite of the key disadvantage for the revealed preferences, and that is stated preferences can be used for anything and everything. So you can use it to value bequest, option values, existence values, indirect use values, and so on and so forth. Whereas the revealed preferences, hedonic pricing, travel cost, is really basically limited to direct use values, either consumptive or non-consumptive. Stated preference methods can be used for anything. Another disadvantage of revealed preference is that it can only be used for things that are on the market already indirectly. So it can only be used for the past, whereas revealed preference methods can also be used for things that have yet to come. They can be used to value future environmental goods and services. Now, another advantage of stated preference methods is that you're not relying on a market, and therefore you're not relying on assumptions about how that market works. You do not need to assume that markets are perfect, that people are rational and fully informed, nor do you need to rely on authorities giving you access to administrative data. You don't need to rely on hotels sharing their records of where people are from. You don't need to rely on real estate agents sharing their data, because essentially you are collecting your own data, and that means that you can collect the data that you need. Oftentimes when you rely on third-party data providers, or when you rely on secondary data or administrative data, there are things in the data that you would have liked to see but are not there. If you use data from France, for instance, administrative data from France, then because France has this pretense that everybody is equal, they do not collect data on religion or ethnicity, because that does not exist officially in France, and therefore you could never with administrative data tell whether the Muslim population behaves differently from the Christian population or the non-religious population in France. That is simply impossible. If you do your own survey, you can ask those questions, right? If that is what you're interested in. The disadvantage, of course, is that you have to collect the data, right? So it is a lot more work for you as an analyst. One of the advantages of collecting your data is that you actually can probe people why they give certain answers. You can actually probe the reasons behind preferences. For all these reasons, and because it's easy to publish if you do it right, this is actually a very popular way of going about environmental valuation. It is the sort of stuff that you can really demonstrate your skills as a researcher. Policymakers also seem to understand this much more readily than revealed preference methods, and therefore it is also popular with the eventual client that is informing typically some government bureaucracy. Those strengths obviously also come with weaknesses. As I said, it is expensive to do because you need to collect your own data, and as I'll make clear over the next 1.5 hours, that is actually very difficult to do, so you need to think long and hard about how to do it. And it actually can be very time consuming between actually conceiving of the study and having completed it. You're typically talking about a number of years. This is not something you can download the data from the land registry and you can run a regression within weeks. No, absolutely not. This is months, if not years, before you see a result. The main disadvantage of stated preferences is that they are stated. This is not what people do, but this is what people say they would do. So you make 3 leaps of faith. What you're interested in is the actual behavior in real markets. That is what we would like to know. You make the assumption that intended behavior is the same as real behavior, that people sort of like live up to their own plans, which a little bit of introspection will tell you doesn't always happen, right? You make the leap of faith that the hypothetical market that you create in your survey is similar to a real market. And you make the assumption that what people say their intentions are their actual intentions. And people are not like that. Even if they know their own intentions and they know what they would do, the human mind is constructed such that, definitely when we're talking to strangers, we do not show our hand, or we do not give complete and full information or necessarily truthful information about what our intentions are, because that is just not advantageous to us to do so. In many situations, and of course in this particular situation, there is no reason to assume that you would report truthfully about your intentions. These are of course the main weaknesses, the main disadvantages, and I'll talk about these at length and about their implications. But this is big stuff. I think 2 weeks ago I talked about the oil spill out of the Exxon Valdez in 1989. You think that is ancient history. The damages awarded to the state of Alaska by what was then Exxon, is now ExxonMobil, were to a large extent based on contingent valuation studies. Similarly, the damages paid by British Petroleum to the state of Louisiana for the damage done by the Deepwater Horizon accident were to a large extent based on contingent valuation. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars paid in compensation. So this is big, but unfortunately also very uncertain and very controversial. So what would you do in a contingent valuation study? How would you design this? And essentially the question is, what would you pay for this good or service that is not traded on the market? That is the core question in the study. So you would start with doing your background research, what is you actually want to do. Then you need to decide on how to survey people, which people to target and how to target them. You need to design your survey. Typically the first draft is pretty hopeless, so you need to test it first on your friends and colleagues, and then through a series of iterations, redesign until it is in a decent shape. And then you need to take it to real people to test it on them. You need to probably redesign it again. Then depending on how you do it, you need to find the people who actually do the interviews for you, run another pilot, because you may think you've done it right, but your interviewers may have completely messed it up, so you need to redesign it again. And then actually you go into the field, entry the data, analyze the data, test, and then finally write the report. And all of these things are important. I'm looking up same guy as yesterday, same problem as yesterday. I'm looking up where I'm going. Sorry, Chris, I'm lecturing. I did not hang up. Instead, I picked up the phone. Where was I? These two first steps are actually important, right? Sort of like doing your background research is important because that is what is driving the whole thing. You need to be reasonably well informed there. But more importantly, and less trivially, you also need to have a decent understanding of what people know about the thing that you're asking them about. Because you're going to ask them questions, and if you can't put yourself in the minds of people who are answering those questions, chances are you ask the questions in a very silly way, in a way that is incomprehensible to them. So you really need to do your research, not just about the issue at hand, but also what people know and understand about the issue at hand. Yesterday we talked about mercury, and of the about 80 students surveyed, about 3 sort of had this vague inclination what mercury does to the human body. And if that is your starting point, then obviously you need to inform people about this before you can ask questions. And if they're confusing mercury with lead, as somebody did yesterday, then, and you don't know that, then you just go completely off the rails with your questions. The survey mode is also important. If I want to target you guys, then an online survey that works well on a mobile phone is the perfect vehicle. But if I want to target your grandparents, then this is the wrong way to go about it, right? Because they're just clumsy with phones. Probably if I want to reach your grandparents, then I need to call them up on a landline, right? You guys probably don't even have a landline anymore. So if I go for a telephone type of survey, then I miss out a large part of the population, right? Telephones also have the issue that people like me who do have a telephone get annoyed actually when people call them in the middle of the day. This is of course when your interviewers work and say, I'm busy doing other stuff, go away, call me back when I'm free, right? So depending on the mode of the survey, you get different people. You could also go and stand in a shopping mall and interview people, and then you get a different part of the population again. So you need to think very carefully about who is my target population and how to reach them. Also, if you do a survey that is designed for desktops or laptops, it can be relatively elaborate and relatively long. If you do a survey that is primarily working on a mobile phone, it needs to be much shorter and simpler and snappier. If you do a face-to-face interview in a shopping mall, then people would give you 2 or 3 minutes of their time. If you go to their doorstep, then they're maybe willing to talk for 5 or 10 minutes and so on and so forth. So you need to think really carefully about how you do it, what is the target, what is my instrument, right? And those things are important. Now, what does the survey itself typically look like? It often has 6 components. You need to ask people about their knowledge. Do they actually know about Mercury? Do they actually care about Mercury? Have they ever heard of Mercury before? Do they just think it's a planet in the solar system or a Greek god? Or do they actually know it's also a metal that is actually damaging for your health, right? And you need to ask people about their opinion of environmental problems in general, their satisfaction with the state of the environment as it is, because that may help you interpret what they're going to say next. So that is all important. Their attitudes about the thing that you're asking about specifically, but also more generally, what do they think about the state of the world, and particularly in this case the state of the environment. Then what you need to describe is, this is the current situation. And let's switch gears because I don't actually know very little about Mercury. Let's say that the current situation is that there's 825 spills of raw sewage per day in England and Wales at the moment. And you need to inform that people that is the current state of the environment, and you would probably need to tell them why this happens. If you don't dump the raw sewage in the rivers and the seas, then the only other place it could go is back up your toilet, which is probably not what you would like. You need to describe the current situation and why it is as it is, and also describe that, yeah, this means that you probably would not want to swim in any lake or stream or river in the UK, and you probably also want to avoid a lot of coastal waters, particularly near outlets. And then, because we're never interested in valuing the total environment, we're only interested in valuing increments, changes to the environment, typically small changes to the environment, you need to propose an alternative. What if we're going to spend £1 billion on improving the sewerage system so that instead of 825 spills of raw sewage per day, we would go down to 100 spillages of raw sewage per day? Right? That is the sort of stuff that you would need to give them. And then the follow-up question is, sorry, the proposed situation is that we go from 825 to 100 spillages per day. And then you need to ask them about how much are you willing to pay for that. And you need to decide how they're going to pay, and you need to decide how you're going to elicit this particular value. I'll come back to that. And then once people have given their answer, you need to start probing. Typically what you find in contingent valuation studies is that there's always a group of people who give seemingly ridiculous answers, either very high numbers, and then you need to probe them. Are you sure? Why do you think this? Can you really afford this? But there's also typically a lot of zeros in there. And then the question is, do you say 0 because you really are not prepared to pay anything? Or do you say 0 because you don't like the way we asked the question? Or do you say 0 because you have some sort of fundamental objection to the idea of putting a price on the environment, right? That is important to know. And then finally, you need to ask about age, gender, income, education, and so on and so forth. The reason that this comes at the end is because a lot of people do not want to give parts of this information and drop out of the survey at this particular point. So if you do it at the start, then you lose a lot of respondents, right? So the two key bits are the scenario that you sketch and the way you elicit the actual payment. And the scenario description is you need to clarify what is going on at the moment, and you need to describe how that would improve, presumably, if you're soliciting a willingness to pay. And you could do this with text, and definitely if you're doing a phone interview or a face-to-face interview, it is basically based on text. If you're doing a mail-in interview or an online survey, then you can include figures and photos, which most people are fairly visually oriented. You can include maps, that really works. If you're doing it online, you can also include video, right? Of course, if you're doing it face-to-face, you can bring a tablet and show people video, right? And that sort of enlivens the whole thing and sort of like attracts a response. And the important thing here is that, and that is one of the reasons why you want to do your background research, is that whatever scenario you describe has to be credible. Of course, also the current situation has to be described in a factual matter, which is getting increasingly difficult with the amount of disinformation that is out there, that people may simply not believe the facts about the current situation. So that is an increasing challenge. But then also what you propose has to be a credible alternative. If you're going to say, returning to oil spills, we're going to prevent all oil spills in the future, that is just not believable, right? Because accidents will happen. The only thing that you can really do is reduce the probability of accidents and reduce the damage done. So the big problem with the Exxon Valdez was that it was a single halt tanker. That means that when it hit a rock, all the oil got out. As a response to that, now most oil tankers are double halt. That is, you need to hit the rock twice before the oil gets out. And it's therefore a lot safer. Also in certain very busy environments, very pristine environmentally pristine environments, there's always emergency response ships nearby nowadays. In case something happens, they can contain the damage. That is a credible response. That is much, much more credible than saying if we implement this measure, there will never be another accident, right? that people will simply not believe that. Also, the way you describe this has to be meaningful. And this actually conflicts with the first step, that you need to do your background research on this. And that immediately means that you know much more about the topic than the people you're going to ask about the topic. And therefore you may be asking, if we're going back to the sewage, one of the problems is that we have 52 mpm fecal coliforms per 100 milliliters, which makes perfect sense to an ecotoxicologist, but doesn't make any sense to you guys. What would this mean? You probably recognize the word fecal there, but that's about it, right? You haven't got a clue whether this is a lot or a little. Instead, you need to show things in a way that is credible to people. With this concentration, don't go swimming, but you can go sailing or paddleboarding or stuff, as long as you don't fall in the water, right? So you need to be a good paddleboarder. Fishing is fine, but perhaps don't eat the fish that comes out, and definitely don't eat it raw, which is a bad idea in the first place, right? That is the sort of information that people understand. And this may be the current situation. The water is fine for fishing and sailing, but not for swimming. And then in a future improved situation, the water will be fine for swimming as well, right? We are far away from that. That is the sort of information that people understand, right? And therefore can meaningfully respond to. And it's very important that you realize that you guys are on average smarter than the general population. That is why you're at university, right? If you ever get to really do these things, that means that you're somewhere in the top 20% of people in terms of intelligence. You have studied the problem. You know so much more about this than the people you're going to ask. And that means that you're completely and totally unrepresentative at that point. And what you think that is general knowledge absolutely is not general knowledge, right? And here we see an example of two overconfident geochemists. It is of course also important that the questions that you ask are neutral. You can talk about fluffy lambs being slaughtered, right? Or you can talk about livestock losses, minor livestock losses, right? And there's a key trade-off there. That on the one hand, you want people to be engaged with your survey. And that means pulling on their heartstrings, essentially. On the other hand, you want to remain as neutral as possible. But if you do it in very dry academic language, then chances are people are not going to follow you, people are going to walk away from you. If you do it in a more engaging, intuitive way, there is a real chance that you're leading them towards a certain answer, right? And these things are just hard, and this is the reason why you want to have a draft, redesign it again, and redesign it one more time, testing for an ever wider group of people. Important corollary here is that you can't really do this without giving people information. And returning to the mercury example, yesterday's totally unscientific sample suggested that most of you guys did not know anything about mercury. So a contingent valuation study about taking mercury out of the air would, and your willingness to pay for that, would start with informing you about why mercury is bad. And at that very point, your respondents are no longer representative of the population, because you told them something that the general public doesn't know, right? So there's many difficult trade-offs to be made. Now let's turn to the payment vehicle. Very important. How are you're asking for people's willingness to pay? So the first question you need to answer there is, how are we going to pay? Is this through an increase in income taxes? Is this through an increase in value-added taxes? Is it through surcharge on your electricity bill or on your water bill? Is it through an entrance fee, if we're talking about, bless you, entering into a park or onto a beach or into a nature reserve? Or perhaps is it as a parking fee, right? And these choices have profound implications. If the question is, we're going to do such and so, and we're going to fund it through an increase in income taxes, you guys, if you're smart, say this is a good idea because as a student I don't pay income tax. Well, but you will be paying income tax hopefully in the near future, right? If you ask a bunch of retired people, we're going to fund this through an increase in income taxes, they say this is a good idea because I don't pay income taxes, right? Whereas if you, and of course income taxes are very much skewed towards the better paid part of the population, so you have immediately distributional implications as well. Whereas if you're going to fund it through an increase in your value-added tax, then everybody pays, right? And actually poorer people pay a higher proportion of their income in value-added taxes than richer people do. So this matters, right? Of course, if you do this in parts of the United States and you say we're going to increase taxes, the answer is no, right? Because people have an aversion to paying taxes in the first place. If you want to increase water or energy bills, it very much depends on the context. Of course, if you do this right after, say, Russia invading Ukraine again and electricity bills have shot through the roof, if then you're going to say at that point in time we're going to increase your bill even further, people are going to protest against the fact that you do it. They may actually be perfectly happy to pay for this. Just this particular payment vehicle may run into strong opposition. If you're going to say we're going to levy an entrance fee for a nature reserve, then people immediately associate this with there is a man or a woman sitting at a booth at the entrance collecting fees, and there will be a gate and fences. I don't like gates and fences, right? So you may solicit actually a response to the idea of gates and fences rather than payment for the nature reserve. Parking charges are great for people who cycle to the site rather than people who drive to the site, right? So you need to think carefully about how you're gonna do it. Obviously, you also need to think about how often people are gonna pay. Is this a one-time payment? Is this a weekly payment? Is this a monthly payment? Is this an annual payment? And you need to make it clear to your respondents that that is what it is, right? So all those things need to be carefully considered. An important thing to realize is that this is not a voluntary contribution, because typically we're asking people to pay for some sort of public good, so don't give them an option, say you are going to pay, right? It's not something you can opt out of. Now, how would you ask this question? And there are various methods for doing so. The oldest is the simplest. How much are you willing to pay for X? The problem with this question is it is a very strange question. you have probably never been asked this question in any situation. If you go to the supermarket, the person at the till does not ask you how much are you willing to pay for your the contents of your shopping trolley. They say, well, this is your bill, right? Or if you shop at Amazon, Amazon is not going to ask you, so how much are you willing to pay for this thing that you just bought, right? You see a little bit of this on eBay and in auctions, that you actually are asked to state your willingness to pay. But in most situations, you are quoted a price and you take it or leave it, right? And in some cultures, there can be a little bit of heckling about the price, but there is a starting point, right? The question, how much are you willing to pay for something, is just not something that your brain is trained to answer. So this is how contingent valuation started, and the result was a lot of noise. What people have done instead, no example showing up, is and there's an example later, of a payment letter or a payment card, where essentially you show a list of prices and then you let people tick, this is my maximum willingness to pay for this. That takes away some of the very strangeness of the open-ended question, but it's a fairly weird thing to do. You also introduce anchoring bias. An open-ended question, people can give you any answer, but you've given them no idea about what would be a fair price. If you give them a payment letter, you sort of give them an idea of a maximum and a minimum price, right? So you're priming them towards a certain answer. And therefore you may bias the results. What people are currently mostly doing a so-called dichotomous and trichotomous choice. Dichotomous choice is essentially a referendum format, and essentially the thing that you are confronted with if you go and buy a box of cornflakes. Because if you go into the supermarket, God, I never buy cornflakes, so I haven't got a clue what they cost. The supermarket essentially tells you you can have it for £2 or not, right? Is that a reasonable price for a box of cornflakes? And that is essentially the choice that you have. Either you buy it for the stated price or you don't buy it, right? And you can do the same in a dichotomous choice type of question, or a referendum-like question. Are you willing to pay £50 per household per year for this? Yes or no? And that is much more familiar. People can say, well, that sounds reasonable. Obviously, what you would need to do is ask different people different amounts, because otherwise you learn very little, right? The big problem here is, of course, that you don't learn a whole lot about people's preferences. I asked all of you guys, are you willing? I asked some of you guys, are you willing to pay 50? Other part of the class, I asked, are you willing to pay 40? Another part of the class, I'm asking, are you willing to pay 60? And what I have for you is either an upper bound, if you say no, or a lower bound if you say no to the question, right? Of your willingness to pay. I don't have actually an idea of your actual willingness to pay, I just know the upper or lower bound, right? And I know how that upper and lower bound varies with different people, assuming that you guys all are the same, right? Because I split the sample into 3. One way of getting a little bit more information is to use so-called trichotomous choice, where the question is, are you willing to pay 50? And then if you say yes, then I have a follow-up question, are you also willing to pay 75? And if you then say no, I have a lower bound, 50, and an upper bound of your willingness to pay, right? It must be somewhere between 50 and 75. If you say no to the first question, then I ask the question, are you willing to pay 25? And then I also, if you say yes to the second question, I have an upper and a lower bound. Your willingness to pay is somewhere between 50 and 25. If you say no to both questions, then I only have an upper bound, 25. If you say yes to both questions, I only have a lower bound, right? It's more than 75. So you learn more about people's preferences in this way. Of course, you ask a second question, and you can say, well, let's do a fourth question or a fifth question. And I've seen surveys where they actually go to 8 or 9 of these questions. And people, of course, then begin to realize, like, okay, every time I say no, they're gonna ask again, so I'm gonna say yes at one point, just because it's getting tedious, right? Or vice versa, you may actually induce a response there as well. So this works to a certain extent. You can ask a follow-up question, and probably 2 follow-up questions. That's probably the limit of how far you can go. But that's how these things work. There is the payment card. So let's look at a particular case study where this was done and see how it is done, just to put a little bit more flesh on this. This is a study not of Stonehenge, but a study of the area around Stonehenge, and that is actually an important distinction. Stonehenge, of course, needs no introduction, a megalithic monument in somewhere near Glastonbury, but I always forget the county because I'm hopeless at English geography. So the issue with Stonehenge is not so much the monument itself, or that was not the issue. The issue is that there's a road nearby, and that road can get, there's actually 2 roads nearby, as you can see on the map. There's a road here, the A303, and there's a road here, the A344. And some people think that it's lovely that those roads are there, because they actually lead you to Somerset and beyond. So that is good. And actually you can see Stonehenge from a distance from these roads, and some people think this is the way it should be. Other people argue, well, this actually takes away the historic character of this monument, because this is definitely not what it looked like when this was built, I think 5,000 years ago, right? And therefore the alternative solution is, you also see the car park here for the visitors, is to put the car park on the ground and put the roads in tunnels. And then the experience of visiting Stonehenge will be very different, because you can't see the roads, you can't see the cars, you can't hear the roads, you can't well, you can't hear the road in the first place, you can't hear the cars on the road, and the ugly car park is also out of sight, right? And some people say, well, this is a good thing. And this is how you would present the scenario, right? Current situation, proposed situation. How much are you willing to pay for this? You need to be more specific, right? The whole thing is going to cost, this is an older study, the whole thing is going to cost 125 million pounds. As I said, you can't see Stonehenge from the road anymore because you're on the ground. Presumably that would also speed up traffic, because now a lot of people slow down to have a good view of Stonehenge, and that creates traffic jams and so on and so forth. So you actually travel faster, particularly for the locals who travel that road a lot. This is a boon. When people are gawking at the at Stonehenge, they're also not paying attention to the road and then drive into things and so on and so forth. So there is advantages of doing this. The study actually did 2 things. It showed the pictures that I just showed, but it also just gave a verbal description of the things that would happen, right? So that is how you would do this. And then what they did was they used the payment letter like this. Which option is preferred, status quo, proposed change, and how much are you willing to pay for your preferred option? And then the payment letter is, yes, I am prepared to pay £2 per year, but no, I'm not prepared to pay £5. And then in this particular example, they left out 5 and 7 as indifferent, right? So it gives you an idea of their willingness to pay. Was paid through a tax, and it was a payment of £3 2 years in a row, right? That is how they did this. And then follow-up questions. If you said 0, why was that? You can argue, well, I simply do not have the money. Other people say, well, I actually like Stonehenge as it is now. Other people said, well, taxes are high enough as it is. I don't think taxes should increase. Other people said, incongruently, that I should not be paying for this. The government should pay, as if the government has money. It doesn't, right? The government has tax money, but not money of its own. But not everybody knows this. And other people said, well, I don't think we should be spending money on this in the first place because we have other problems that are more urgent, right? The results were something as follows, perhaps surprisingly. 55% said things are fine as they are, just leave it be, right? And actually, a good few of those were prepared to pay for not changing anything at all. Presumably they wanted to, I mean, it's a bit unclear what they would be paying for, right? Because there was no infrastructure investment or anything. But they cared enough about the views from the road to say, I'm actually willing to pay to compensate those suckers that want to put the roads on the ground, to let them go away, have them go away. And there were actually people willing to pay to say, keep things as it is, don't spend any money. 45% actually prefer the alternative, and we're willing to pay a good bit more, around £9 per year. And the main motivation that they gave was actually this would secure Stonehenge for future generations, which is a nonsense argument because the roads do not damage Stonehenge. It just spoils the enjoyment of visiting Stonehenge. Now, because the people who were willing to pay for the tunnels were in a minority but were willing to pay 3 times as much, actually their aggregate value exceeds those who were willing to pay to keep things as they are, and the difference between the two is 180 versus 66 million, and the difference is 114 million. As far as I know, a decision has been made to put these roads in tunnels, but it's only a decision in principle. There's actually the works haven't started yet. So that is how these things are done. Now, it is 10:02, and the next chapter is very long, so I suggest we break for 10 minutes now and reconvene at 11. Let's look at all the things that can go wrong in contingent valuation. Before I go there, there's a number of ways of testing the validity of any scientific study. The first one is just face validity. Does it make any sense what you're doing? So yesterday Donald Trump identified a problem that people hadn't heard of before, and that is that a lot of people who are migrating illegally into the United States or legally into the United States as refugees are speaking languages that are not from this earth. They are speaking languages that are only from Mars. And then the question is, of course, how would you actually communicate with these people? That is a valid question, or would be a valid question if any of what he said was remotely true. I think the lesson of this story is that you shouldn't do drugs, at least not to the extent that Donald Trump had. So that is the first criterion. Does it make any sense what you're doing, right? The second validity, type of validity is construct validity. Does your instrument measure what it intends to measure? As part of it is content validity, and I'll come back to that. Does it actually measure all of it or just part of it? Construct validity, actually the Stonehenge example is a good one, because a lot of people interpreted this as the value of Stonehenge rather than the value of the road infrastructure around Stonehenge, the view from Stonehenge. And that is of course a different question, and you would expect a different answer. Criterion validity has to do with accuracy. What you can do there is see whether similar things have similar values and dissimilar things have dissimilar values, would be a way of testing criterion validity. Of course, you can also try, and that is test and retest reliability. You can see whether a follow-up study will find roughly the same answer. You can find whether a different method for the same thing would yield the same result. And finally, you can test validity with its compatibility with theory. What you would expect is that income elasticities are positive. So if you do a survey and you find no differences in the willingness to pay between rich people and poor people, then probably something is wrong. You would also expect a negative price elasticity. That is, if you sort of quote different prices to different people in a sort of referendum dichotomous choice format, you would expect the supply curve or the demand curve to be sloping downward. And if it doesn't, then probably something is wrong with the way you designed your study. So those things are important to keep in mind. But let's look at some of the more specific biases that you can find in contingent valuation study. The most important one is the hypothetical, the non-commitment bias. And essentially this is, you ask people what they would pay, but you don't ask them for their money. So they can give you whatever answer they want. And this can be quite serious. There was a study, again, not related to environment, but to cultural heritage, where they were interviewing people, how much are you willing to pay to go visit this castle? And they were standing in the parking lot of this castle, and people were just arriving, did not know what the entrance fee would be. This was in the days before the internet. And they asked people, are you willing to pay £1 or £2 or £3 to get in? And people gave an answer, right? And this was a trick question, because at the end of the interview, the final question was, 5 minutes ago you said that you would pay £2 to get in. I can offer you a ticket for £2, and then test whether people would actually pay for a real ticket. And around 43% of people refused the offer, even though they had just bid for a price. 5 minutes later, they sort of abandoned this. And for some people, this was, they gave a good reason why they refused. It may be that it turned out that the castle was much bigger than they thought, and they did not have enough time, or that it started raining or something, and they would come back another day. But for a good few people, they just revealed, yeah, I was just bullshitting you a few minutes ago, right? And that is unfortunately what happens. There's some things you can do against this. A big problem with contingent valuation is that it's also vague and hypothetical and so unexpected, and you may actually give people some time to think. And if this is a face-to-face survey, you can actually announce the question and say, well, I'm first going to ask you a couple of other questions, and then you have time to mull it over in your head, and then I'm going to return to the willingness to pay question. That is one option. One variant of this is if you do a mail-in survey, that you actually drop in the survey, you give people a week to think it over and then respond, assuming, of course, that they use this time to mull it over, right? Another thing that people do is introduce a cheap talk part in there where you actually remind people that yes, you should take this seriously and please think carefully and so on and so forth, where the idea is that people then actually listen to you, not tune out and move on, right? So there's ways of going around it, or at least mitigating this, but they're not necessarily that convincing. And then there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. I talked a little bit about protest bids. Some people may just say no, go away. No, I'm not willing to pay more taxes. No, I don't think an entrance fee should be levied because a gate would go up. But some of these protest votes can actually be very subtle and hard to understand unless you start digging deeper. So a while ago they did this study about people's willingness to pay to help improve the Baltic Sea, or the environmental quality of the Baltic Sea. And Baltic Sea has many countries around it, so they interviewed people from a number of countries, and surprisingly what they found was that Poles who live in Poland are willing to pay to help clean up the Baltic, and Lithuanians who live in Lithuania are willing to pay to help clean up the Baltic, but Lithuanians who live in Poland are not prepared to pay to clean up the Baltic. And that is a puzzling result, because obviously Lithuanians per se have nothing against cleaning up the Baltic, and people who live in Poland have nothing against cleaning up the Poland. The problem, the protest votes were concentrated with Lithuanians who live in Poland. And digging a little bit deeper, the problem was not so much that they did not care about the Baltic. The problem was that they did not trust the government of Poland with their money, right? So protests can actually be fairly subtle, and sometimes you need to dig quite deep to find out what is going on here. In the first week about valuation, I actually talked about the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation. Willingness to pay is you're paying for something that you don't have. Willingness to accept compensation is you get compensated for losing something that you did have. And obviously these are different questions, but people also give different answers to this. And not just about big things, but also about small things. So they've done studies with asking people, how much are you willing to pay for a coffee mug, right, with the university logo on? And then people said £5 because that is what it cost in the shop downstairs, right? And then in another half of the sample, they gave people a coffee mug, and then they said, I'm going to take it away from you. How much should I give you in return? And then people did not say £5 because that is what it costs in the shop downstairs, but they said, no, I want £10 or £15. And these differences are actually persistent that even for trivial goods, there is a discrepancy between willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation, and therefore you need to be very careful what question you're asking and what question is actually the appropriate question. Are we gaining something or are we losing something and compensating people for their loss? There may be a strategic bias in an open-ended question or in a payment card type of thing. People may realize that they're not actually being asked to pay, but they may realize that their answer will be averaged with the other 1,000 people who are taking the survey, and then that the average will be taken to the ministry or some other part of the government, some agency, for some sort of investment by the government. And if you realize that and you care about this particular good or service and you know that your answer will be averaged out, then of course the rational response is not to state your true willingness to pay, say £10, but it would be to say £100 or £1,000, because then you're cranking up the average, right? And people do this, and of course it may also be the other way around, right? That you actually do care, but you think that the rest of the world cares more about this, so you're going to downplay your response. One way around this is, of course, to use the dichotomous choice, where people can't play this sort of games, or at least not to the same extent. I talked about information bias, right? That you have to start a survey by giving people information, and therefore the sample is by definition unrepresentative. I talked about non-response bias, right? If you do it through telephones, landlines, then I won't reach you guys. Interviewer bias, prominence bias, yes saying, nay saying, is all sort of in the same class of problems. So people tend not to think about these things, and then somebody walks up to you in a shopping mall and start asking questions about this particular problem, and you haven't thought about this, but the person opposite obviously has, because they're asking questions about it, and that may sort of like trigger in your mind that, oh, this must be important, and the fact that I haven't thought about it is probably my fault and my ignorance, and I really should pay more attention to this. It's really more important than I thought, right? So that is prominence bias. Some people have a tendency to say yes to things, more prominent in some cultures than in others. Other people have a tendency to say no, regardless of what the question is, right? And that may bias the results. And if you're doing face-to-face interviews, you can actually have interviewer bias. So, again, going back to the shopping mall, a pretty girl walks up to you and starts asking questions. What are you gonna do? Well, your first idea is, ooh, she's pretty. Second is, oh, she's interested in the environment, right? So I'd better go and impress her, right? Doesn't work, guys. She's just there to make money. It may also be that somebody with a bad breath walks up to you and starts asking questions, and then you actually say, oh my God, go away, right? Nothing to do with the subject. Interviewer bias can go quite wrong. In a different life, I was teaching a much more extensive version of this particular module, and as one part of this, the students had to do their own contingent valuation, and they were split into 10 groups doing this, and at the end the regressions showed that only the interviewer ID turned out significant. The only pattern that we could detect in the data was that some interviewers got different results than others. So that is a problem. A good friend of mine, an old friend of mine, a very nice girl, made money, paid her way through college by doing this sort of interviews. And one of the studies that she was involved in was with the mathematical skills of immigrant population in the Netherlands. And as I said, she was a very nice girl. She felt sorry for them, so she helped them solve those mathematical problems. This is, of course, not what you want your interviewer to do. The most egregious example of interviewer bias comes from a medical study where they tested people. They asked people about their sexual habits and that sort of stuff in the context of HIV and AIDS. And as part of that survey, they actually took blood samples of the people that were interviewed. So you can think about response bias, non-response bias there. If you come and ask for my blood, I would tell you to go away. But in this survey, they actually did, and they discovered two particularly problematic interviewers. One, when they tested the blood samples, it turned out that the blood was not from humans. The guy took blood from cows and submitted that because he was too shy to ask people for their blood. In another interviewer, it turned out that everybody he interviewed was HIV positive. And that was because he too was too shy to ask people for their blood and had donated his own blood, not knowing that he was HIV positive. It's one way to find out. So this really is important, definitely if you're doing face-to-face or telephone interviews. Now, the other big block of problems comes with embedding, spatial embedding, temporal embedding, sequencing, part, whole bias, scope, insensitivity. It's all the same thing. The problem was probably best identified again in the series of studies that came out of the Exxon Valdez accident. So, big oil spill, big court case, people using contingent valuation studies to quantify the damage done to the environment in Alaska, or in Alaska as some people call it. And then, of course, ExxonMobil hired other experts sort of to counter the valuation studies. And they hired a couple of very prominent economists from MIT, and they did a study not in Alaska but in Louisiana, where the question was the protection of migrant birds from the oil ponds that are there. So there's a lot of oil drilling, or there was at that time a lot of oil drilling in Louisiana, and then you have some oil that is left and you just put it in a pond somewhere, and that is it. Birds are pretty stupid. They just think that is water, they land in it and get covered in oil and die as a result. So that is the situation. What can you do against that? Well, you can put nets over those oil ponds so that the birds can't get in, and that obviously costs money. And then the question was, how much are you willing to pay for protecting those migrant birds from accidentally landing in those oil ponds? And they split the sample into 3 parts, and one part of the sample they asked, how much are you willing to pay to save 30,000 birds per year? Actually, they were not birds, they were ducks even, a specific kind of bird, right? Second part of the sample, they asked, how much are you willing to pay to save 300,000 ducks per year? And the third part of the sample, they asked about 3 million ducks per year. And the answer was the same. That is, people were willing to pay the same amount to save 30,000 birds, 30,000 ducks, as they were willing to pay to save 3 million ducks. Now, obviously, that violates all principles of economics, right? You should be willing to pay more if you get more, but you should not be willing to pay the same for a different quantity, right? And that sent people into a bit of a tizzy, and the question is, where does this come from? And there's two sort of broad explanations of this. One, and that is probably the one that is most widely held, or there's three interpretations here, right? One is contingent valuation is all nonsense. The second is the so-called warm glow hypothesis. And the idea there is that people don't want to think about all the bad things in the world, but they do realize that they have a certain duty to make donations to charity, either in time or in money or in kind, right? But they don't want to think about it too much. So they may have set aside a budget, say $500 per year, that they're willing to pay towards good causes. And they may have sort of instituted this rule of thumb. Last year 10 people knocked on my door to donate to this charity. So this year I'm going to give $50 to every charity that knocks on my door, right? And that is a way of sort of like, you're doing good, but you're not bothering yourself with all the misery in the world, right? It's sort of a self-protection type of mechanism is one way of interpreting it. And the other interpretation is that you sort of get a warm glow, you get a good feeling about yourself if you donate to charity, right? Now, if that is how people behave, and to me it doesn't sound implausible at all, then people just see this sort of contingent valuation question as another charity knocking on my door, and I'm just going to do the rule of thumb, and I'm going to give $50, right? If that is how people behave, they don't listen to what you're saying. They just say, good cause, not going to listen, here's $50, go away. If that is how people behave, then this is the response that you would get, and it doesn't matter whether it's 30,000 ducks or 3 million ducks, right, that you're saving. So that is one interpretation. The other interpretation is that people can't or won't count. Now, I don't know your relationship with ducks. I can't count them because they never sit still. And if you see a large volume of ducks, it is actually very hard to determine how many there are. And really, I can't be bothered that much to count ducks. So if people count ducks as 1, 2, 6, many, and that is how you classify amounts of ducks, which makes perfect, I mean, it makes perfect sense to have a pretty rough idea, a pretty close idea of the amount of money in your bank account, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense to know the number of ducks that live in Brighton, right? Who cares? If that is how you approach duck numbers, then 30,000 is many ducks, and 300,000 is many ducks, and 3 million is many ducks, and really in your mind there is no difference between those numbers, and that would explain why you are willing to pay the same amount for all of them. So that may happen, and it does happen in these sort of studies. That makes, of course, the interpretation of the results very, very difficult. The implication of all this is that people answer a different question than what was asked. And that is, of course, a normal human trait. Whenever you're talking to somebody, and definitely when you're talking to somebody who is not particularly familiar to you, and I mean, I see this all the time in exams, I ask a question, you guys answer what you think is the question, right? Which is not necessarily the same as the question that I asked. And if you just inspect the way you interact with people, or the way people interact with you, people tend to answer the question that they think you should have asked, or they give you the information that they think you should know, rather than the thing that you asked for. And there's absolutely no reason why people would treat a survey in a different way. People answer the question that is in their minds, which is not necessarily the same as the question that is on paper. So that makes interpreting these results very, very difficult. And this can go for sort of the size of the problem, for the time span of the problem, and so on and so forth. I talked about starting point and anchoring. If you show somebody a payment ladder, you essentially said, well, this is the maximum and this is the minimum. That I think is reasonable. And then again, people may use some sort of heuristic, right? Some people say, I'm very poor, I always go for the cheapest option on offer. Some people say, I always go for the, because I want to show off, I always go for the most expensive option. But most people would say, well, if this is the range of prices, then I go somewhere in the middle, right? And then of course the response is determined not by their preferences, not by their willingness to pay, but by what you as an analyst gave to them. So all sorts of things can go wrong, and that is the reason why there is so much research on this, because if things go wrong, that is of course a way to shine as an academic, to try and make it better, or at least try and convince people that you have made it better. But definitely, if you want to do this state of the art, if you want to have a credible contingent valuation study, then there's a lot of effort that will go into the very careful design and testing of what you're gonna do, and very extensive analysis of what you found, right? But it remains a very popular, and because it can deal with all values, not just direct use values, it remains an essential tool. 20 minutes left. One alternative to contingent valuation that is getting increasingly popular is known as contingent choice. Choice modeling, conjoint modeling comes in under a range of names. Essentially this follows how you shop most of the times. Go back to Lancastrian types of demand, just as with houses, right? And there's a bundle of attributes, and you don't ask somebody for their willingness to pay for a particular aspect or a particular good or a particular service, but you ask them to choose between alternative options. And then of course you vary that to figure out their willingness to pay. And the format is actually what you would see, say, on Amazon, right? This is a few years old, so that's more than a few years old by now. So essentially, if you go to Amazon and you shop for a mobile phone, then you won't see these because all these models have been taken off the market. But you see a menu, like different colors, different sizes, different styles, different cameras, different memory, different speed, and so on and so forth, different Wi-Fi connection, different mobile connection. Right, those are all the things that you may care about in a mobile phone, and then obviously also different prices for these phones. This is the sort of thing that you do regularly. Not, I assume you don't buy a new mobile phone regularly, but if you go to the supermarket to buy cornflakes, you get the same sort of problem. You walk into the aisle where they sell cornflakes, and you see different boxes, different shapes, different sizes, different weights, sugar, non-sugar, gluten, gluten-free, and so on and so forth, right? And different prices, of course. And that is how you make your choice for cornflakes. There's a limited set of options, all different things going on, and then you pick some, right? And essentially, contingent choice puts you in a very similar, a very familiar situation. And this is actually a study or part of a study that was done by the body that regulates electricity in Scotland, whose name completely escapes me at the moment. So the question is, what are we going to do with the power supply in Scotland? And there's various options that we have. We can invest in wave energy, we can invest in offshore wind, we can invest in onshore wind, right? And they look different. That would have different implications for the cost of electricity, and that is given here in the second row. Here's my mouse. This option would cost £80, which is a 20% increase. This would also cost £80, and this would cost £40, right? We can do it in different locations, in the northeast, in the southwest, or here, of course, this is onshore on the east coast. And then there's also the impacts on wildlife. Can be negative, can be positive, or can be negative again. Which of the three options do you think is best? Right? Tick the box that is here, or if you dislike everything, we just keep things as they are. That is, we're going to continue to rely on coal and gas, not so much oil, which of course leads to greater emissions to the environment, right? So this is your supermarket scenario, right? These are your options. Which of the three do you like? And you have the option to leave the supermarket without cornflakes, right? So this is much more familiar to people. It sort of like takes away this whole strange idea. Somebody walks up to you in the street and asks you, how much are you willing to pay for a whale, right? It's a bizarre question, and you would not know what to answer because you would not know the going price for a whale in the first place, and you never thought about this problem. It's a very strange thing to do. This is a much more familiar and therefore takes away some of the strangeness of the question. And these choice cards come in basically a standard design. You have your options, you could put 2 options on there, or 3 or 4. If you put 17 options on the card, then obviously it becomes unreadable. You have your various attributes, the things that you care about. Again, you can have 4 of them or 5, but you can't have 80. So you need to make a choice there. How many you're going to include, what are the key attributes, right? And then you present all of them at different levels, 120, 120, 0, right? And of course, one of the attributes, if you're interested in people's willingness to pay, in this case, pound sterling, then that is one of the attributes that has to be there, right? It doesn't have to be in principle there, but if you are interested in the monetary value of things, then that absolutely has to be the case. And then the idea is that you give every respondent 3 or 5 or 7 of these choices, and from that you infer what is going on. So you don't get a whole lot of information from people for every choice that they make, so you want to have a large number of these choice cards. But of course, if you're taking the survey and you see one of these, you click the button, and then another one pops up and you click the button, and you're willing to do that 3 times, 5 times, but then it gets very tedious, right? So the more people do, the more you learn about their preferences, but also the more you annoy them, right? By asking the same question or variants of the same question over and over again. So that implies that you don't learn a whole lot about your respondent and his or her preferences, and that means that you need to include a lot of them to get some idea of what is going on. The design of these choice cards is very important, and I don't believe that this study was ever done, but that is me. You immediately see the problem here, right? The human eye is drawn to pictures. So we see pictures of the technology and we see pictures of the location. So that is what you're going to focus on. And then hidden in here is wildlife impact. And you actually have to look twice before you see that. And it's not presented in a very visual way. So going back to prominence bias, the people who are interviewing me are also do not really care about this, right? Because they didn't put any effort in making this visually appealing. So this is a bad design of a choice card, right? This is a little bit better. Increased cost of electricity per year, per household. There is probably something that people can understand. But then also there is this weird thing. I mean, people understand 120 and then you say it's a 30% increase. And now you're making an assumption about what people pay. And this is probably a 30% increase on the average electricity bill in Scotland. But some people may actually know their electricity bill and know that it's not, 360 pounds per year, right? And may think, well, this is nonsense. I pay much more for my electricity, or much less, and 120 is not 30. And they may actually start protesting against that. So you need to be very, very careful about how you design these things, how you present the information. Is it better than contingent valuation? I think it is, particularly because it takes the unfamiliarity away. My feeling is that I'm definitely not the only one, and I think actually contingent choice is overtaking contingent valuation in applications. Because you're not leading people, because you're not suggesting things but just give them a range of choices, I think also the tendency to say yay or nay is actually reduced, so that is all good. Because the willingness to pay is sort of just one of the choices, it's not obvious that this is the focus of the study, even though it often is. You would also solicit fewer protests. So all of this makes it better than that. The problem with this particular approach is that it may be harder for people to do, because essentially you're asking them to solve a multi-criterion problem. You actually have all these attributes going on, and people may actually panic and say there's too much choice and I don't know what to do. So it may be cognitive overload. One thing that has been observed in the way people respond to these things is that you give them 4 attributes, but for all the choices that they're going to make, they're just going to focus on the location, if they're very selfish, right? If it's near my home, I'm against. If it's somewhere else, I don't care. So that is how I choose. Or they may just say, well, I really like wave, and whatever the option is, I'm always going to go for wave. It may just be that people sort of block out all but one of the attributes and base their choices on that. So they're not really answering the question again that you asked. They're answering a different question. People are like that. Good thing about this technology or this method is that most of it is done online, and you may like it or not. If you want to do this in a very sophisticated way, you can actually put tracking software with this, where you actually track people's movement of their mouse or their keyboard, and in some cases you can activate their camera on their computer and actually track their eye movement to sort of like see what are they paying attention to. It is intrusive, may not necessarily get you past the ethics review board, but it's technically feasible, and then you can filter out those people who say focus only on the location or only on the type of technology, right? So you can get around this, but it is doable, not necessarily easy. And then, of course, as you may have guessed, the analysis of the results is actually a good bit more complicated than when people say, are you willing to pay £50? Yes, no, right? The analysis is more complicated. Instead of a simple logic, you would need to go back to the methods that we have been using, that we've been talking about for the travel cost method, the random utility model. You actually need to go and use either a conditional logit or a mixed logit model. So it is a bit more complicated for the people who analyze the result. In terms of setting up the study, it is very similar to a contingent valuation, right? You need to make all the same sort of decisions, but of course now you need to think of the choice cards as well, or of the choice cards instead of the payment letter, and so on and so forth, right? 7 minutes left, so go quickly through this case study. It's about carbon offsets. This was a study published 15 years ago now by the guy who used to teach this, George. And essentially it was about, are you willing to pay for an offset for the emissions, the CO2 emissions that you get when flying? So offset A, offset B, or no offsetting at all? Yes, yes, no. Additional benefits. This one focus on human development. This one focus on biodiversity. This is not certified. This is certified. This is going to cost you £8. This is also going to cost you £8. And here we have the I'd rather walk away empty-handed option, right? So that is the way it was designed, and then people were asked, I believe, 5 of these, and then you can stick this, in this case, a mixed logit model, as you can see from the output. And you won't recognize the mixed logit when it bites you, right? And what we see here is that, yes, people are willing to pay, and this is the odds ratio, right? People are more likely to pay for an offset than not. That is what free means, and this is an odds ratio, which essentially means that 75% of people are prepared to pay for this. And if it also helps biodiversity, they are more likely to pay, and so on and so forth. If it's certified, they are more likely to say yes to the question, I am willing to pay for that. And then there was a follow-up, open-ended sort of question. Why did you say what you said? And that clearly shows that there was a strong heterogeneity in tastes. And some of the results were quite funny, right? You see the sort of the standard environmentalist, it's an emergency, we must act. If I don't do my bit, I can't blame others for not doing their bits. When the ice cap melts, and we must fight for the penguins as well. Penguins are not really threatened by climate change. And other people sort of gave very negative responses. This sounds like a scam. It's actually true. Most offsets are a scam. So that is actually right. It's bourgeois and distracting to do the whole offset thing. It's sort of like I have an principled objection to the idea of paying to help the environment. And let's all fly more to do more good, right? You discussed me. Walmart used to run this ad, the more you buy, the more you save, which is of course true relative, but not true in absolute sense. And this is a very similar type of sentiment. If you're buying an offset and it's not a scam offset, then it's not the more you fly, the more you do good, but you actually take away the negative impact of your flight, right? So that's it. You're not going above and beyond that. But it's important to include questions like this just to get a taste of how people respond to what you do, because A, it is sometimes very funny, and B, it actually tells you something that helps you interpret the results that you've seen. So that was it for today. You notice that the slides go on, just ignore that. Next week we're going to change gear, right? On Monday we're going to do another exercise with data and everything, this time looking at the results of a contingent valuation study. But on Tuesday we're going to switch gear to policy instruments for environmental cleanup. I hope to see you guys then.